I never imagined that a single text could change the course of my life. That night, my apartment was quiet except for the soft cries of my baby in the next room, the hum of the refrigerator, and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I had run out of formula, and my bank account was empty. Every instinct in me screamed panic, and I felt the weight of exhaustion settle deep into my bones. I pressed my phone to my ear and typed a message that made my fingers shake. I didn't care who I was texting. I didn't even notice I had entered the wrong number. Desperation had taken over, and all I could think about was keeping my child fed and safe. The message was simple. I explained my situation, begged for help, and tried to hide my fear behind polite words. Then I pressed send. Immediately I regretted it. How could I trust a stranger with something so personal, so vulnerable? My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt exposed in a way I hadn't felt in years. And then, almost instantly, a reply arrived. The text made me pause. It was short and careful, yet somehow it carried weight, authority, and an unfamiliar warmth. Said, "I can help, but why are you so scared?" I stared at the screen, a shiver running through me. How could someone know that? How could someone sense the tight coil of fear in my chest? I tried to tell myself it was coincidence, that it was only words on a screen, but deep down, I felt a strange pull toward the person on the other end. I typed back, trying to sound casual, though my hands were trembling. I explained that I was just a mom, struggling to keep my child fed. And I wasn't sure why I was texting this number. His response was immediate and unnerving. "You were meant to text me." There was a confidence in those words, a certainty that made my skin prickle and my breath catch. It was almost like he could see right through me, and the thought made my heart both race and ache. The messages continued, each one stirring something unexplainable inside me. He seemed to know more than he should, asking questions that probed not just my circumstances but my thoughts, my fears, my quiet moments of loneliness. I had always believed that life was ordinary, predictable, and safe. Now I was being drawn into a world that pulsed with danger and mystery, a world I couldn't yet name. By the time his last message came, I felt a mix of fear and curiosity that I couldn't resist. "Meet me. Midnight. My office. Don't worry. I won't hurt you." I read the words over and over, my heart hammering. Midnight. Alone. A strange office. Every logical part of me screamed to run, to lock the door and ignore this stranger forever. But beneath that fear, something else stirred. A voice inside me whispered that this was not chance, that whatever waited at that office was not ordinary, that destiny had found me, and I was about to step into a life I had never imagined. The hours until midnight stretched endlessly. I tried to distract myself, to feed my baby, to tidy the apartment, to breathe through the tension that curled in my chest. I could feel it even in my sleep, a quiet stirring that was both thrilling and terrifying. Something was waiting for me, and I knew with a certainty that frightened me, that it was not human. Finally, I left the apartment, gripping my coat tightly around me as I walked through the dark streets. The city was unusually quiet, the usual hum of life replaced by shadows and wind that seemed to whisper. Every step toward the office made my pulse quicken. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself it could be a harmless man, maybe a wealthy stranger moved by compassion. But deep down I knew the truth before I reached the building. There was something different about him, something otherworldly that pulsed beneath the surface of his words, something that promised both danger and wonder. When I reached the office, the lights were dim, the glass doors reflecting the moonlight in jagged patterns. My chest tightened, a mix of anticipation and fear coursing through me. I had no idea what I would find inside, only that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. The door opened before I could knock, and I stepped in, and the air shifted. The faint scent of earth and something untamed hit me immediately, and I realized with a shock that this man, this stranger, this savior, was not like anyone I had ever known. And that was when I saw him. Tall, broad-shouldered, eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. He moved with a grace that was almost inhuman, yet there was a warmth in the lines of his face, a pull in the depth of his gaze that made my breath catch. He smiled just slightly, and in that moment I understood. The wrong number I had dialed, the desperate text I had sent, had not been a mistake. It had been the beginning of a story that would change everything I thought I knew about fear, love, and the world beyond what I could see. The first time he spoke to me in person, it was as if the air itself had shifted. His voice was low, smooth, and commanding, carrying a weight that seemed to press against my chest. I wanted to step back to remind myself that I was just a single mom, exhausted and overwhelmed, that this man was a stranger. But there was something magnetic about him, something impossible to resist. His eyes held a depth I couldn't name, like they had seen centuries of secrets and yet rested on me as if I mattered more than the world itself. He introduced himself simply, no fanfare, no explanation for how he knew me so well from a single text. His name rolled off his tongue with power and grace, and I noticed that his movements were precise, almost predatory, though not threatening. I couldn't shake the sense that he was more than human, that the faint glimmer in his eyes was a clue to something dangerous, something wild. I wanted to look away, but my gaze kept returning, drawn like a moth to a flame I could not name. We talked briefly about my situation, and he offered help for the baby. The formula arrived the next morning, accompanied by a note that simply said, "You are stronger than you know." The words were ordinary, but the way they were written made me feel seen, as if he had looked into my soul and understood every fear I had tried to hide. I carried the note with me, clutching it against my chest, feeling warmth and fear intertwined. Over the following days, his presence became a constant undercurrent in my life. I began receiving messages that were not simply about help, but about me, about my safety, about things I had never told anyone. He warned me of subtle dangers, odd occurrences that I had dismissed as coincidence. I began to notice shadows moving differently, the sensation of being watched even in places I thought were safe. Each warning he sent made my pulse quicken and my trust in him grow, though I had no idea why. One evening, I returned from work to find him standing outside my building. My heart raced at the sight of him. He didn't knock or call out. He simply waited, silent and still, like a guardian shadow. My instincts told me to run, yet every part of me stayed rooted to the spot. When I finally stepped closer, he spoke, his voice low and firm. "You are in danger. I need to protect you." There was no anger in his tone, only certainty and a power that made me tremble. I realized then that he was capable of things beyond what I could understand. There was a strength in him that radiated, a sense of control over forces that were invisible to me. I wanted to question him, to demand answers, but I couldn't find my voice. My instincts whispered that this man, this alpha, could either save me or shatter the fragile life I had built. I began to notice subtle signs that he was not like other people. The way shadows seemed to bend around him, the faint glimmer of eyes reflecting light that should not have reflected. He never explained himself fully, and yet I sensed that every secret, every hesitation was intentional. He was drawing me in, teaching me to rely on him, to trust him, even as my fear pulsed through me. There was a tension that built quietly between us, one that I could not name but that I felt in every glance, every slight movement. One night he appeared at my window. I was exhausted, sitting on the floor beside my baby's crib, watching the quiet rise and fall of her chest. The moonlight outlined him in sharp, almost unreal detail, and I realized that he could have entered without me ever knowing. I felt my heart hammer in my chest as he looked at me, his gaze penetrating, holding more emotion than I could have imagined. Without a word, he simply stood there, protective and still, a silent promise that he would never let harm touch us. His presence was both thrilling and terrifying. I wanted to step back and insist that I was fine, that I could handle life on my own, but the pull toward him was irresistible. It was as if my world had been gray and ordinary until the moment he arrived, and now color, danger, and excitement had flooded in all at once. I knew I was being drawn into something that was not entirely human, and the realization both thrilled and frightened me. The nights became harder to sleep, my mind turning over his warnings and the strange sensations that followed him. I began to question everything I thought I knew about reality. Shadows in corners, sounds in empty rooms, and the lingering sense of being watched were no longer coincidental. He had brought me into a world I could not fully see yet, a world that promised danger, protection, and a connection that I could not ignore. By the end of the week, I realized I was no longer afraid of him in the ordinary sense. I was afraid of the power he held over me, the pull of his presence, and the undeniable bond that seemed to be forming between us. It was a tension I could not escape, a quiet storm that promised both wonder and peril. I had no answers, only a growing certainty that my life had changed forever, and that the man who had appeared in my life was more than human, more than a protector, and perhaps the one I had been waiting for without even knowing it. And in that quiet, moonlit moment, I understood that everything that had led me to send that desperate text, every fear, every sleepless night, had brought me exactly where I needed to be. I did not know what tomorrow would hold, but I knew one thing clearly. I could not walk away, and I did not want to. I had begun to accept that his presence in my life was no accident, that he was somehow bound to me in ways I could not yet understand. The feeling of being watched, protected, and guided by someone so otherworldly had become a constant hum beneath the surface of my days. Yet even as I trusted him more, a shadow of unease crept into my mind. There were moments when his eyes darkened, when his expression sharpened, and I sensed a danger that was not meant for me to touch. I wanted answers, and at the same time I feared them. It happened one rainy evening. The streets glistened with reflections of neon lights, and I hurried with my baby bundled in a blanket, trying to keep us dry. My phone buzzed with a message from him. I froze when I read it. "Meet me now. Alone. There is something you must see." My heart thumped in my chest. Part of me wanted to run, to leave the mystery unsolved, to preserve the ordinary life I had clung to for so long. But another part, the part that had already been drawn into him, would not let me turn away. When I arrived, the office was quiet, almost empty, but there was a tension in the air I could feel even before I stepped inside. He was standing near the window, rain streaking across the glass behind him, and the shadows around him seemed to stretch and pulse in a way that made my stomach twist. The moment I crossed the threshold, he turned, his gaze locking onto mine, and I realized the truth I had suspected but not wanted to admit. He was not just different. He was an alpha, a being of immense strength and power, a protector and a predator, bound by instincts I could barely imagine. "I wanted to tell you before it became necessary," he said, his voice steady but carrying a weight that pressed against me. "You are in danger. Not just ordinary danger. Something is hunting you, and it will not stop until it has what it wants." Fear clutched at my chest, sharp and sudden. I tried to speak, to ask what he meant, but no words came. I could only watch as he moved closer, each step deliberate, controlled, yet filled with an energy that made my heart race. The air around him seemed to vibrate, charged with something I could not see but could feel in every nerve of my body. "You are tied to me in ways you do not understand," he continued. "Your life, your child, your very soul, they are connected to mine. That connection makes you a target." I wanted to protest, to deny it, but deep down I knew it was true. The strange occurrences, the shadows that moved when no one was there, the unexplainable pull I felt toward him, they were signs I could no longer ignore. I realized with a jolt that my ordinary world had been ripped away, replaced with something darker, more thrilling, and far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. Then he showed me. With a motion of his hand, shadows around the room shifted, forming shapes that should not have existed. Creatures, dark and silent, lurked at the edges of the light. I felt my knees weaken as I realized that these were not illusions. They were real, drawn to me, and yet unable to approach while he stood between us. His presence was a barrier, a shield forged by his alpha strength, something primal and untouchable. "You have a choice," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "You can go back to your life, risk the dangers that follow, or you can trust me. Accept that the world is bigger, stranger, and more perilous than you imagined. You do not have to do this alone." The weight of his words pressed down on me, heavier than any burden I had carried in my ordinary life. My instincts told me to run, to take my child and flee from the impossible world that had invaded our lives. But every glance at him, every step closer to the truth drew me in. There was something in the way he watched over me, the quiet power that surrounded him, that made me want to surrender to the unknown, to trust him completely. And then the sound came, a low guttural growl that reverberated through the walls, followed by a movement in the shadows that made my heart leap. He shifted instantly, his body coiling like a spring, ready to defend, ready to strike. I understood then that this was real. This was not imagination or fear or paranoia. This was danger, and I was in the middle of it. He turned back to me, his expression serious and intense. "I cannot protect you if you do not let me. And you cannot stay safe if you continue to deny what is happening." My pulse raced and a shiver ran down my spine. The storm outside matched the turmoil inside me. I realized that my life had changed in a way I could never undo. I was no longer just a single mother struggling to survive. I was part of something bigger, something that carried both peril and a bond one could not yet name. And as he moved toward the shadows, ready to confront the threat, I understood that I could no longer remain on the sidelines. Whatever came next, whatever choices I had to make, my life and my heart were now entangled with his. The tension between us, the pull of the connection, and the danger we faced were all rising to a point I could not escape. And in that moment, I realized with a mix of fear and anticipation that nothing would ever be the same again. The night air was heavy with rain as we stepped out into the deserted street, the city lights shimmering against wet asphalt. Every sound was magnified, the distant wail of sirens, the rustle of leaves, the rapid beat of my own heart. I had followed him without hesitation, though fear and anticipation twisted in equal measure inside me. He had promised me protection, but tonight I felt the full weight of what that promise meant. The shadows that had been unsettling before now seemed alive, shifting unnaturally at the edges of my vision. He moved ahead, eyes scanning the darkness, muscles taut and ready, and I followed closely, holding my child tightly against my chest. There was an urgency in his movements that made me uneasy, a tension that suggested this was no ordinary threat. I had already seen glimpses of his power, but tonight I would witness its full scope, and I felt a mixture of awe and terror. The air around him seemed to hum, charged with an energy I could not name, something primal that set my nerves on edge. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the alleyway, moving fast, silent, and deliberate. My breath caught in my throat, and instinctively I stepped closer to him. His hand found mine, not in comfort, but to steady me, to anchor me as the danger approached. The figure emerged fully, and I saw what I had feared but could not imagine. It was not human. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, teeth sharp, and it moved with a speed and grace that made my stomach twist. He stepped in front of me, a wall of strength and authority. The creature paused, sensing him, and a low growl rolled from its throat. I realized with a shock that what we were facing was connected to him, to the world he had brought me into. This was a predator, yes, but it was also a warning, a message from a realm I had only glimpsed in fleeting moments. My pulse raced as I felt the tension rise between protection and threat, trust and fear. Then he spoke, his voice low, commanding, carrying a weight that made the creature hesitate. "Go. You have no claim here." The words were simple, but the power behind them was undeniable. The shadow shivered and then retreated, melting back into the darkness as if it had never existed. I felt a shiver of relief, but it was short-lived. He turned to me, his gaze intense, and for the first time, he spoke of the truth in a way I could not ignore. "You are not safe simply because I am here. There is more to you than you realize, more to your child than I can explain. You are tied to forces older than the city, older than time, and they will not forgive ignorance." My mind reeled. Tied to forces? Older than time? I tried to grasp the meaning, but my thoughts scattered under the weight of what he was saying. The world I had known, the life I had fought so hard to maintain, felt fragile, insignificant, almost laughable in the face of what he revealed. The ordinary struggles of motherhood, bills, and sleepless nights were now a backdrop to something vast and impossible. I wanted to ask questions, to demand explanations, but I found I could not. His presence alone was overwhelming, his gaze holding both reassurance and an unspoken warning. I realized then that this man, this alpha, was not just a protector. He was a gatekeeper, a force intertwined with destinies I had never imagined, and I had stepped unwillingly into a story that would change my life forever. Then the unexpected happened. Another movement in the shadows, closer, faster, and this time there was no hesitation. He grabbed my hand and pulled me behind him just as a dark figure lunged. I felt a brush of cold air, heard a faint hiss, and instinctively I tightened my hold on my child. My heart pounded, fear and awe entwined, and I realized that my ordinary world was gone. There was no turning back. After the attack passed, he knelt beside me, his hand still gripping mine, and he looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "There is no safety in denial. You must accept what you are part of, or you will never survive the next trial." His words were firm, yet beneath them I sensed a vulnerability he did not often reveal, a glimpse of the burden he carried alone. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my racing thoughts. The world outside seemed muted, the rain softer, the shadows less threatening, but I knew it was only temporary. Something had shifted between us. The bond one felt had deepened, no longer a quiet pull or a subtle attraction. It was urgent, undeniable, and laced with a tension that left me both terrified and exhilarated. I knew that whatever came next, I could not face it without him, and yet I could not ignore the growing fear that our connection had consequences I could not yet comprehend. As he helped me to my feet, the rain dripping from his coat and the wind tangling my hair, he looked toward the city with a focus I could not read. "They know you are here now," he said quietly. "This was only the beginning. The next move will not wait for permission." His words carried a weight that pressed on my chest, and I felt the full gravity of the world I had stumbled into. I held my child closer, feeling the tiny heartbeat against mine, and I realized that everything was changing. My life, my heart, my future, all were now bound to him, to his world, and to dangers I could not yet name. And as we stood together in the rain, the shadows shifting around us, I understood that the turning point had arrived. There would be no ordinary tomorrow, and in that moment I sensed the next threat approaching, unseen but inevitable, and I knew that whatever happened, nothing would ever be the same again. The night air was sharp and electric as we moved through the city streets, shadows stretching around us like living things. Every instinct in me screamed that this was the moment I had been drawn toward from the very first text. The danger was no longer distant, no longer abstract. It pressed in from every direction, palpable and immediate. I clutched my child tightly, my knuckles white, and I realized that there was no turning back. The world I had known, ordinary and safe, had vanished, replaced by a reality ruled by forces I could barely comprehend. He walked beside me, calm, controlled, and yet every muscle in his body vibrated with a quiet power. I could feel the energy radiating from him, an invisible shield that separated us from the darkness surrounding the city. He was an alpha, a protector, a force that belonged to another realm, and yet he had claimed a space in my life, in my heart, that I could not relinquish. I wanted to speak, to ask what we faced, but the words lodged in my throat. I knew instinctively that I needed to trust him, that hesitation could cost us everything. And then they came, shadows rising from the alleys, moving with a speed and precision that made my pulse hammer. They were not human. Their forms flickered at the edges of vision, glimmering with something unnatural, their intentions clear in the menace of their movements. I felt fear claw at me, a pure raw terror I had never known. But beneath it, I felt another sensation, an unexpected calm, a grounding presence beside me that whispered strength and courage. He was here, and he would not let them touch us. The confrontation was swift, silent, and tense. He stepped forward, his presence a wall between me and the darkness, and I realized in that moment how much power he carried. The shadows hesitated, reacting to something invisible, a force they could not breach. I watched as he moved, deliberate and controlled, his energy pulsing in a way that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. Every instinct I had told me to hide, to run, to clutch my child and pray, but I stood frozen, knowing that this was the turning point. Then came the revelation. He turned to me, eyes glowing faintly, and spoke in a voice both tender and firm. "You are more than you know, more connected to this world than you could imagine. Your child carries a strength that draws attention, and you are the heart of that strength." I understood in that instant that the danger had never been random, that our lives were entwined with forces far beyond the ordinary. The realization was terrifying, yet it ignited something fierce inside me. I was not powerless. I was not merely a bystander in this story. As the shadows began to press closer, I made a choice. I would not run. I would not hide. I would face whatever was coming with him, trusting in the bond that had grown between us. The alpha beside me recognized the decision immediately. His gaze softened, and for the first time I saw vulnerability in him, a quiet reliance on me that mirrored my own reliance on him. In that moment we became more than protector and protected. We were partners, united by choice, by circumstance, and by a connection I could no longer deny. The threat passed as suddenly as it had appeared. The shadows retreated, leaving the streets quiet and empty once again. I felt my knees weaken, relief and adrenaline mixing into a dizzying rush. He placed a steadying hand on my shoulder, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the night air. We had survived. I was part of a world that pulsed with unseen forces, with danger, with protection, and with possibility. My child and I were safe for now, not because the world had changed, but because I had accepted the reality we now lived in, and because he had become our guardian, our anchor. We walked through the quiet streets together later that morning, the soft light illuminating everything in gentle shades. The streets were peaceful, yet I sensed the presence of forces that had been drawn to me, lingering in shadows I could not see. He explained more about the balance he maintained, the responsibility he carried, and the need to remain vigilant. And while the words were serious, there was also a warmth in his voice, a reassurance that no matter what came, we would face it together. I realized as we moved side by side that I had changed in ways I could not have predicted. The fear that had ruled my life, the doubt and uncertainty that had plagued my days, had been replaced by a quiet courage. I knew now that survival was not just about avoiding danger, but about embracing connection, about trusting instincts and the strength found in unexpected allies. And in the reflection of his eyes, I saw the same truth mirrored back to me, the recognition that we had both been changed by the night, that we had faced trials and emerged stronger, and that the bond between us was now unbreakable. By midday we returned to the apartment. The ordinary world resumed its pace around us, but I felt a clarity I had never known. I could see the life ahead, both the mundane responsibilities of caring for a child and the extraordinary challenges that came with knowing the truth. And I knew with certainty that whatever shadows lingered, whatever dangers might arise, I was no longer alone. I had him, and together we had found strength neither of us could have imagined on our own. As I tucked my child into her crib, I took a moment to reflect on the journey that had begun with a single desperate text. That one message, sent in fear and uncertainty, had brought a force into my life I could never have predicted. It had brought danger, yes, but it had also brought protection, understanding, and a connection that had become the center of my world. I realized that life's extraordinary moments often arrive unannounced, and that courage and trust could turn the most frightening experiences into revelations of strength and love. He stood by the window watching over the city, and I felt the pull of his presence, steady and reassuring. I stepped closer and placed my hand on his arm, feeling the warmth and the quiet certainty that we were no longer simply two lives crossing paths. We were entwined, bound by choice, by circumstance, and by a bond that had been forged in danger and tempered in trust. And in that simple touch, I knew that the extraordinary world he had introduced me to was not something to fear, but something to embrace together. As the sun climbed higher, I allowed myself to smile, truly smile, for the first time in months. The danger had passed, the lessons had been learned, and the bond we shared had solidified into something enduring. I realized that life was no longer about surviving day to day, but about embracing the unexpected, about finding strength in connection, and about welcoming the extraordinary into the ordinary. And as I looked at him, the alpha who had come into my life in the most unexpected way, I understood that the journey was far from over, but for the first time, I was ready to face it with courage, trust, and a heart open to the impossible. The world outside continued on, oblivious to the forces at work, but inside me, everything had shifted. I had survived, we had survived, and in the quiet of that morning, I knew that the most important truth of all had been revealed. Life, even when it challenges you, can bring unexpected allies, unimaginable strength, and connections that change you forever. And for the first time, I believed that this was only the beginning of a story that we would face together. Whatever lay ahead,